So fabulous to see you all. So I sent yesterday 2 wonderful little pieces of homework, the Kerchief by Shmuel Agnon, and then Rabbi Harold Kushner's sermon delivered on December 3rd, 1976, at the occasion of his son Aaron's bar mitzvah, when Aaron was about to pass away later that year after his bar mitzvah. And he gave a sermon on the Kerchief. So I just want to first see, by show of hands, how many of you were able to actually read both pieces of text?
No.
Okay. So good. So let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together, and then we'll get right into it. Baruch atah Adonai.
Malcolm, A-L-C-U-M, is that a word?
Asher bachar banu mikol
Malcolm.
ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. If everyone can please mute, so we won't hear ambient noise. Thank you so much. So you'll remember how we got here. We were studying about the prophet Elijah. And one of the most famous stories about Elijah is the story of a rabbi, Rabbi Levi, who wants to know when will the Messiah come? Because, of course, Elijah has access to inside information since he lives in heaven. He never really died, and he comes back down to earth. So Rabbi Levi says, hey, you're Elijah. You know the scoop. You know the deal. You talk to God. You're up in the heavenly court. When is the Messiah going to come? And you remember, those of you who were here last week, this is a famous passage from Sanhedrin, that Elijah says, oh, you're going to find the beggar when you go to a leper colony, and there's a lot of people with sores and wounds and bandages, and the Messiah will be bandaging and rebandaging his wounds. He's a leper amongst lepers, but he does his bandages in a different kind of way. Rabbi Levi sees him and asks him, says, oh my God, this is the guy, and then asks, when are you going to come? And he says he's going to come today, but of course he doesn't come today. And the end of the story is this: he will come today if you follow God's laws. That's the famous story in the Talmud, that the leper in a leper colony is going to be the Messiah, if we all heed God's laws today. And that is the basis for Shmuel Agnon's story, the Kerchief. And I want to first start by just asking people what they thought of that story. He spins a whole famous story, Hamid Pachat in Hebrew, on the basis of that passage that we looked at last week from Sanhedrin. What did you guys think of the story? Did you like the story? Did you not like the story? If you liked the story, what did you like about it? And if you did not like it, what did you not like about it? So, Maddie Donna, thank you.
I loved it.
Tell me more.
I loved it. And then what I really loved was then reading Rabbi Kushner's interpretation of the story, sort of bringing it into modern language.
Yeah.
But I will tell you that I read it out loud on our ride home from the Cape yesterday. And Bruce said it was better than any audiobook.
Yeah.
There was just something so beautiful about the language and about the imagery and about the innocence of a young child.
Yeah.
It just was a very beautiful thing to read.
Yeah.
And I think that Rabbi Kushner's interpretation in more modern language really sort of focused it.
Yeah. Let's deal first with the Agnon story, and then we'll talk about the Kushner sermon on the Agnon story. The Agnon story, the language, he seems to capture a feeling of a Jewish home, a feeling of a Jewish holiday, a feeling of a Jewish Shabbat. Do you feel that the feeling that he captured is lost to us? Or do you feel that the feeling that he captured is a feeling we also have?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Well, what I really thought was that their whole life focused around the Sabbath. Everything was about Shabbat. And I don't know that we really think about our week the same way.
Right.
It's suddenly Friday, we prepare for Shabbos, but I don't really know that we think about it Monday through Thursday the way that family did. And
Yeah.
that gives them a reason to keep going and to get through the next week.
And Maddie, do you have a part of obviously the kerchief was so important because that's what the mother wears when she lights the candles and brings in Shabbat. Did you grow up in a home where lighting candles was an important moment in the week?
Yes. It was something my grandmother who lived with us did. And then after that, my mother did. But
Is that something
I lived in a pretty secular house,
Yeah.
but Shabbos, we definitely acknowledged Shabbos, and my mother lit the candles.
And was that something that you did as well when you were raising Liz and Dan?
Absolutely.
And
We still do it as a family now.
You do it now. Okay. Right. So
Absolutely.
Agnon gets at this moment that feels like it has a lot of resonance. And he uses that language and he captures this innocent time from the innocent perspective of a 13-year-old, because he's a bar mitzvah in the story. What were some other reactions of people about this story? Any other reactions? I have a question for you. One part of the story, I mean, it's a lovely story and a beautiful story and a lot of pathos to the story. One part of the story that was not lovely was the beggar who appears in the latter part of the story, who is shunned by everyone, including the house of study, including the house of prayer, etc. And I'm wondering why? Why would the beggar be shunned by a house of prayer, by a Jewish community? And I'm wondering if we do that or if we don't do that today. Anyone want to take that? Why does his community, which seems to be so traditional and so Jewish with the holidays, etc., why would they react that way to a beggar? Anybody? Linda Leffert. Linda, you're muted.
Well, I'd say for one thing that maybe I'm too cynical, but we all know, about the words about how you should treat a beggar, but I certainly don't think, and I think most people don't think that everybody necessarily does that or does what they know they should do. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that, I'm not very steeped in the Talmud, or steeped at all, in the religious texts to have an opinion, that's based on history. I'm just having a reaction based on human nature. I think, I never interpreted any of that to make me think that, any beggar who appeared, anywhere, and, any Jewish household would just automatically welcome him or her. I think for me, that's not realistic.
Yeah, I think that I find that the reaction of that town and of that shul, that's what I do all the time. When I see beggars, I don't see them. If you go to New York, especially if you go to San Francisco, where my kids live, there are beggars on every street corner. And there are people living in cities, they sleep on the streets. And there's just something, I remember years ago when Eliza first came to the shul, she and I were going to this prison every week to meet this woman who was in prison. And the prison is in a very challenged neighborhood. And there were a lot of beggars always asking for something. And I would never give anything to a beggar, and I never saw a beggar. I was exactly like the people in this town. And Eliza always had granola bars or apples. And she would always give a granola bar or an apple to the beggar. But I found the reaction of this town, when you read it, you think, oh my gosh, how could a synagogue do that? And I think, at least I do that all the time. There's something about extreme, extreme poverty, extreme disease, extreme human need that, Mother Teresa responds to, but that the rest of us tend to avert our gaze. That's one of this story was kind of a mirror for me on that point. And it's interesting that the whole legend of Elijah and the Messiah presents the Messiah, who's going to be the most powerful person, in the guise of somebody that most of us would not see, would choose to avert our gaze from. So that was one of the points about the kerchief that kind of struck me. Anything else about the kerchief before we go to Harold Kushner on the kerchief? Okay, Harold Kushner on the kerchief. And first, the context that he's giving this sermon at the bar mitzvah of his son, Aaron, who would die later that year. So just the context of pathos and poignancy and affirmation of life and loss, and that the text is this. In what ways does this story kind of speak to the life setting when Rabbi Kushner gave this sermon? Anybody? So it's obviously it's a bar mitzvah. His son is celebrating his bar mitzvah, right? But it's also about loss, even in the midst of life, and life in the midst of loss. And then the backstory that Agnon wrote this for his sponsor, the person who paid Agnon's bills, whose son was supposed to have his bar mitzvah in Berlin in 1933, and Hitler had come to power, and they were obviously among the lucky ones. They got out early before Wannsee, and they went to Palestine at the time. And so this bar mitzvah boy also was growing up, and it was so, Rabbi Kushner's interpretation is that childhood is about innocence and protection, and adulthood is not just that you can read Torah or put on tefillin, but adulthood is, oh my God, there's so much pain in the world. Oh my God, for Shakin, like there's Nazis. And for his son, oh my God, I have a chronic illness and a congenital illness and a progressive illness. And for every person, just deep pain. So what did you think of, what did you take to be the message? If you were listening to this sermon and you went home and your loved one wasn't there in shul and said, what did the rabbi talk about? What was the point of this sermon? What would you say was the point of this sermon? Can anyone summarize the point of this sermon in one catchy sentence? Anybody? Dottie, I'm going to see you in shul tonight. So do me a favor and give me a summary. What's the point of this? And you have to unmute, please.
Irregardless of circumstance, life goes on. And you've got to realize this, excuse me, you've got to realize this, and unfortunately you have to accept what God has given you, and life will proceed, although with all this sadness, it's very difficult.
Right, so the sadness is built in, and right, so the context here is there is a lot of sadness built in. I think one of the important lines of Rabbi Kushner, just to that point, is this, I think, I'm reading on the end of, at the end of the sermon, this, I think, is what it means to be grown up. It means finally coming to terms with the world's imperfections, realizing that the world is a much more complicated place than you used to think, and putting your own problems in the context of the whole world's rough edges and unevennesses. Now, that's like, I thought, a very thoughtful interpretation of what it means to be bar mitzvah. Not that you count in a minyan, and not that you give a speech, and not that you can chant Torah or Haftarah, but what it means to be a bar mitzvah, what it means to be an adult. I thought this was a profound point, simple but profound, is that there is just unremediated and unremediatable pain in the world that comes with. There's going to be pain in the world, and there's going to be pain in your world, and you have to deal with it. And every morning you're going to wake up to the pain and brokenness and the unevenness and the rough edges in the world and in your own world, and it just is. And that is the core insight that an adult has, that a child is spared from, right? Like that, that's a reading of childhood. What childhood is, you don't have to deal with Buffalo and Ukraine. Childhood is, you don't have to deal with Roe v. Wade is getting overruled, and women in poor towns in red states are gonna have to have unwanted children or endanger their lives in unsafe procedures. You don't have to deal with that when you are, you don't have to deal with the fact that our democracy in red states is under attack. You don't have to deal with that fact, that there's actually a fascist rise in America. You don't have to deal with that fact when you're a kid. You don't have to deal with Ukraine spiking anti-Semitism. All this stuff you don't have to deal with. You get to just play baseball and have tea parties, and everything is good. And the essence of adulthood is, no, yeah, there's beauty in life, but there's also all this brokenness. Now, in the context of all of this, and what unites last week's passage and the kerchief by Agnon and the sermon, is the Messiah business. Now, Messiah, is not a huge number for our world. It's a big number, by the way, for Chabad. When I was going to rabbinical school in the 90s, I was in New Jersey, in the holy city of Teaneck, taking the George Washington Bridge every day into Manhattan to Harlem, where the seminary is at 122nd and Broadway. And every day, both ways, from New York to New Jersey, and from New Jersey to New York, there was a big billboard of Menachem Mendel Schneerson and a whole line about the Mashiach. And Mashiach, and we want Mashiach, Messiah, we want it now. And that was the line, we want Mashiach now. And if you've ever been to, now we don't, since the pandemic, we've not been going to so many Simcha dances and such. And maybe you never went to this, but there was a time when the biggest number at Simcha dances, bar mitzvahs and weddings, was Mashiach, Mashiach, Mashiach. And there was something about Mashiach that even in our relatively secular circles, at least that number got people going. And then bands would play, and people like us would get really jazzed by Messiah. Although outside of Simcha dancing, it's not really a big deal in our world, very big deal in Chabad. And that is what unites, the theme of Messiah unites the passage in the Sanhedrin, the story, and Kushner's sermon. So let's talk about the story. There's a lot in here about the Messiah. This boy remembers the legend about the Messiah, thinks about the Messiah. What's the connection of what's the point of the Messiah in the story? Kerchief by Agnon. What function does Messiah serve in the story? Maddie, thank you.
Well, I think he's a sign of hope.
Mm.
And my feeling was that the saying of you can't judge a book by its cover. The fact that because he looked different and he was in such bad shape, people shunned him. And yet underneath was the possibility of tremendous hope. And the boy looked past that. The boy looked past that. The boy didn't see him as something to be afraid of.
Right.
And I think that maybe Rabbi Kushner used that analogy too, because I remember his son. And in his later years, it was difficult to look at him. He looked different. And I think about what we do now, how we respond, not just to the beggars under the train station, but people who look different from us. We immediately, we have a reaction to people who are coming over the borders on the south, very different from the people who are coming from the Ukraine, because the people from the Ukraine look more like us. So we have a sense of sympathy for them. But when people look different and act different, we shun them. We're afraid of them.
Thank you.
The boy looked right past that.
Yeah. So I think, you know, so the question is, what do we do? In what way does the Messiah actually function? And part of it, I think you're absolutely right, is about seeing people and hearing people who are very different from you. But the function of the Messiah in the story is we want some relief from this broken world. And the Messiah and the Messianic age promises us a counter narrative, a counter reality, where the pain that we feel now, we won't feel. So the boy, if you look at the story, the boy dreams about the Messiah when he is all alone and feeling lonely, like he's missing his father. And when the Messiah comes, a father won't have to go to the fair in Lashowitz, and we won't have to be without our father, right? So the Messiah is a more perfect world, a world more perfect, where all the problems that we are too familiar with in this world, we won't have anymore. And that's that's, I think that is the seduction of Messiah. When Mashiach comes, whatever problems that we are having now, when the Messiah comes, it's going to be a better world. It's going to be a more perfect world. We won't have these problems. Now, Kushner has a particular point of view, and I think this is so memorable. Who, according to Kushner's sermon, who can we not bring the Mashiach for? Who can we not be the Messiah for, or bring the Messiah for? Ourselves. We can't be the Messiah for ourselves, right? We can't somehow bring a Messiah who is going to take whatever our top 3, 5, 7 problems and make them go away, okay? And also, we cannot be the Messiah or bring the Messiah for the world, right? There's Ukraine is still going to be Ukraine. Today is the 3-month anniversary. Buffalo is Buffalo. The reversal of Roe is the reversal of Roe. All the problems we have are the problems we have. And nobody can be a Messiah to make all those go away. So we cannot be the Messiah for ourselves, can't make our own problems go away. And we cannot be the Messiah for the world. But this is so powerful. Who can we be the Messiah for? Somebody else, right? We could be the Messiah for somebody else. And that's what happens in the story, right? Because the boy gives his kerchief, which is clean and pure, and Agnon makes a whole point that the kerchief is holy and clean and pure and perfect. And he gives it to this beggar who uses it to bandage his wounds. And the boy was the Messiah for this beggar. He didn't solve all the problems of the world. He didn't solve his own problems, but he was the Messiah for somebody else. And the moral of this story is be the Messiah for somebody else. Now that is a religion I can get behind. I love this sermon, and I love this message. And I also love how it takes this ancient teaching, Messiah, which is so problematic and so prone to abuse and so irrelevant, and it makes it really relevant and helpful. You cannot be the Messiah for yourself, and you cannot be the Messiah for the world, but you can be the Messiah for somebody else. You can give your clean, pure kerchief to somebody else who will bloody it. And that act is bringing salvation into the world. Sheila Kempler.
But you're changing the notion of Messiah altogether. Messiah is not out there in the world. He's not going to save us. So it's like God is within us. You're saying the Messiah is within each of us. It's not out there.
Correct. And that's obviously accurate. It's obviously accurate. I mean, the Christians are still waiting for the second coming. You know, the Lubavitcher Rebbe wasn't the Messiah. Shabtai Tzvi wasn't the Messiah. It's obviously accurate. There is no Messiah.
But they say he's the Messiah. Aren't they waiting for him to come back?
Right. So the question is, what is a better religious practice? And when you take the Messiah doctrine literally, it, at least in Jewish circles, that has not ended well. Like Shabtai Tzvi was going to be the Messiah. That was a disaster. So the better teaching to me is this teaching of Rabbi Kushner. The Messiah is something that each of us could be mobilized to be for somebody else. That's a beautiful teaching to me, much better than just waiting around for some chimerical thing to happen, which never will happen. Any last comments? Well, thank you guys, and I will see you next week for our last class. Thank you so much. Bye.